Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor. I'm here to provide you with an introduction to something new to you, usually TV shows, and hopefully providing some context along the way. In today's episode, a lot of context. It'll just be me here providing my thoughts on a rewatch of the first season of Severance. First, some general impressions, a review of the season in full, and then many theories, something I began if you happen to have caught those recap discussions from 3 years ago now. Still available on the feed if anybody wants to track them down. I discovered some clues about the plot of that first season of the show by doing some analysis of the names of the characters. Something that I had done so many years ago, completed that character by character name analysis, but only after I had finished the show off. So some of that coming in this upcoming episode. And then based on that analysis and some additional discoveries I made during the rewatch, I have much speculation about what is to come in season 2. And I think there are a lot of clues as to what Lumen is up to. All that being said, you would expect that there will be spoilers if you have not completed your rewatch or first watch of this season of television, the first season that is. You may want to skip out of the analysis once I get past the early impressions section of the podcast. A few show notes later this week. We'll be discussing the 8th episode of The Agency, now just 2 weeks away from conclusion. And those 2 weeks, those 2 final weeks, overlap with the first 2 weeks of our coverage of Succession. Also, for anybody who was wondering where Darren went, he's just on vacation, and I should be recording with him over the course of the next week or so, catching up on anything he's been watching and planning out something for us to watch here on the feed as well. The number one candidate at this moment, by the way, would be Prime Target, another spy series here on, we've covered so many spy series recently, and also available on Apple TV Plus, so pretty convenient for anybody who will be covering our Severance coverage. That, of course, is all contingent on whether that show's even worth watching, but at least those pilot episodes we'll be discussing in the near future. And if you want to put it in your calendar, that show actually does not premiere until the 22nd, 1 week after Severance. So more details to come. I also, somewhere in the middle of all these new shows that are premiering, plan to publish an episode where I talk about my favorite TV series and movies of the year. At first, I was planning to do this on the new year, but there's just so many things I hadn't watched yet that I've been catching up on, even things that had just come out in theaters. And then I thought, well, the Golden Globes weekend would not be a bad time to do it, considering they talk about TV shows and movies, and maybe it has shaken up the Best Picture award season with some of those awards. But next week, the Academy Awards nominations get announced, so maybe that's the excuse to at least discuss those particular films as they become more and more available to watch. But that will also be right around the time that the Severance episode drops, so it's a pretty congested January. And honestly, going forward as well, February brings us The White Lotus, which is possibly the most anticipated series here on the feed, considering our coverage of the previous season and how successful it was. And Yellow Jackets is coming back at the exact same time, another show that we covered here that was successful for us on the podcast. And things don't actually start to cool down until the summer, but even there we have some very high-profile series premiering, the final season of The Bear, the final season of Stranger Things, the final season of Squid Game, which has just been announced. We will not have to wait long for that cliffhanger ending. If you have watched Squid Game Season 2, it's only about 6 months away. So stay tuned for some of those new series we'll be covering. Obviously, stay tuned for our Severance coverage, as well as the wrap-up of our coverage of The Agency. Email us your feedback at any time, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. Check the show notes for the email address, and while you're there, check the link to my Letterboxd, where I am catching up on some of the films of 2024 that I've missed, and writing reviews if you are curious to see my opinions on some popular films that I don't discuss here on the podcast. Usually the negative reviews, to be honest. I, in general, do not put negative reviews here on the podcast, but you can definitely find some on my Letterboxd feed. Okay, so I found this rewatch of Severance to be extremely entertaining. I had not seen the show again since its initial run. As I've mentioned here on the podcast before, the number of listeners we got on a regular basis skyrocketed during our coverage of Severance. And I think the culture, as well as us here on the podcast, Son and myself, were blindsided by the success of that show. It was intriguing to me. I have liked much of Ben Stiller's directorial output. I always like a black comedy. I like a satire on corporate America when you consider how in the past 3 years, even more so than at the moment when this series came out, I've worked in many of these large Fortune 500 companies as a contractor over the course of my career, and they all have these corporate mantras and this cult of personality around their CEOs, oftentimes pretty uncharismatic folks. But it became the trend that everyone needed to have this type of corporate cult as part of their branding. And oftentimes many of these CEOs almost had to, whether they were successful or not, had to write a book about their corporate philosophy. Most of them were ghostwritten by oftentimes the same ghostwriters that created these oftentimes very cliched and generic corporate cultures. And this is the kind of satire that you see in, for decades now, in films like Office Space and The Office, for example, that overtly poke fun at this idea of corporatism. But in a way, the series itself, this series, Severance, was prescient in the fact that just in the past few years, at that moment, of course, but especially since then, this has been a 3-year wait on the second season of the show, this cult of personality around CEOs and around these companies has become more and more prevalent. I mean, really culminating this year when you consider that Elon Musk not only has this enormous cult of personality around him who can move markets if he says that some meme stock is worth it or some crypto coin that seems sketchy as hell, honestly, oftentimes. And if he sicks his sycophants onto it, it'll jump in the markets and then everyone else will jump on board as well. To the extent where now he is extremely involved with our political decisions, even, of course. But he's not the first one. You think about the loyalty to Steve Jobs back when he resurrected the Apple brand and the villainous but outsized portrayal of Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook CEO, from The Social Network, which is a really fascinating film to see now when you consider how small that company was and how culturally relevant and vilified to a large extent that company has become. And most interestingly enough, of course, is that Zuckerberg has become a bit of a villainous figure in the culture. And if he wasn't the Jesse Eisenberg version of the character portrayed in the film, and he certainly was not, by the way, that was very much a caricature and more a critique of that culture in general, he certainly has become that character. He's become the character that was portrayed in the film. So all this is to say that the way that corporatism has replaced the centers of culture in the past, like churches, our fascination and fixation with these CEOs and their companies, and even the fact that you would hate a company, even if you just don't like them, the fact that they have become so central to our sense of self and as a country as well. And at the exact same time that we are more and more fixated on these companies, fixated on their success and their size and their scope, we as the employees in those organizations become more and more disassociated from what they actually do. The average person who works at Amazon may be packing a box or managing a database that coordinates the logistics of deliveries. They are just this tiny little part of this massive machine. And we are so disconnected from the output of that labor as these companies get larger and larger and these jobs get more and more and more specialized. And in technology, it's even more prevalent. That's where I work. I work in technology. And of course, there's all this corporate speak about how your job is so important. You're changing the world. But in the end, you're just pulling this little anonymous lever and you wonder, how does this fit into the larger picture of these corporate goals? And then, of course, there are people who work for Facebook and go home and hear from their relatives at Thanksgiving that Facebook is evil or TikTok is evil and is ruining the country. But those people are just trying to make a living, and their day-to-day activities are not evil in any way, but perhaps the overall goal of that company may be in direct opposition to your personal beliefs. And then how do you factor that in potentially when you are also just this little cog in the machine? And if you don't do that job, someone else will slot in there pretty easily. So there's all this moral compromise we make in this current moment in history, which all culminates honestly in a beautiful metaphor here within the series itself. Given what I just outlined before, maybe it's better for you to not think too much about what is the output of your activities. And maybe the work, as it's become more and more granular, is kind of tedious. And honestly, just reminds you every single day that when you were a kid or even when you were in college getting your degree, this is probably not the kind of work you expected to be doing. Maybe disconnecting yourself from the reality of that, from that conscious context, makes doing the job easier, maybe. And of course, corporations are fully aware of this. And this whole culture since the 80s of these companies all run by MBAs, all reading out of the same books and teaching the leadership at these companies that you have to keep the employees engaged by giving them these little rewards. And those rewards can be just a new job title, for example, or a new set of responsibilities, or just a pat on the back. And of course, that's all exemplified here in this series explicitly with these silly finger traps and caricature drawings and all the little rewards, which of course, anyone who's worked in an office can laugh about this because there are all these silly rewards that we're expected to take in lieu of a salary increase, for example. But more so, as we are expected to do more and more, dedicate more of our time, be available 24/7 oftentimes for these companies, and are distracted from the traditional pillars of a community, and oftentimes even our family, depending on how stressful our jobs are. There is a lot in current corporate theory about building that internal culture through these exercises, through these team building experiences, and of course, the corporate philosophy. And it's something as basic as we give 1.5% of our gross income to local charitable organizations. We're improving our community. Or we pay for carbon offsets for all the electricity that we use. But it goes beyond that. Some of these internal corporate documents talk about how your corporate family is more valuable to you than your outside friends and family. And this, of course, is all intentional. It is a way to build your loyalty to the company without paying you more money. And of course, as satire should, all of these things are taken to extremes in Severance. So imagine that for many people, for many, many people, their true friend group and their true purpose in life and the thing they look forward to every single day is being back at work, not because of the work they do, but because that's where my friends are. And I want to do my job because it helps them and they are my family. We all know someone who's overinvested in their job, oftentimes overinvested in a job that is, from our perspective, from the outsider view, pretty inconsequential. But obviously to them, the center of their worlds. So let's take that to the most ridiculous nth degree, where simultaneously the cynical view that, man, I really don't want to do this daily grind. I wish I could just turn my brain off while I'm at work, is made literal. And simultaneously, the version of yourself that you are at work, where you are literally a different version. We all do this, right? We all code switch when we're with our family, when we're with friends, when we're with different sets of friends, when we are in a different experience, like at a stadium, watching a concert. And of course, we are not those people when we are at work. We are another version of ourselves, a better version of ourselves in many ways, but one that perhaps doesn't have a lot of the unique characteristics that we would express in a different context. So we are always different versions of ourselves, but imagine cutting off that version you are from inside of work to outside of work, and that naive version of yourself that is trying to do the job efficiently, and not as a performance of some aspect of yourself, but truly all you are. And how then all of these corny, oftentimes corporate mantras and goals are taken so literally that they become the central tenets of your personality. They are parenting you to a large extent. And simultaneously, of course, you may work at Facebook or one of these large companies that I mentioned earlier, and you can at least make a conscious decision to pay attention or to ignore some of the critique because you hear it. And when you're at home, you hear it on the news. You are the Mark character who hears the critique of Lumen repeatedly. And of course, his Audi is making that decision to go back to work. So he has all that context. But even though his innie is just an aspect of himself, that internal aspect of himself has no say in the matter. And of course, that particular aspect of the story doesn't really have any true real life metaphor in that there is no way to have this separate consciousness, obviously, or a consciousness that's perhaps the same, but doesn't have all the context of the other persona. But I'd argue that there are, and I'm certain we all felt this at some point in our lives, no matter how happy we are with our current jobs, that there is some aspect of you that feels thwarted, that aspire to be something else. And life got in the way, or there wasn't enough time, or there wasn't enough money to go to school, or whatever those circumstances are. But there is some aspect of your personality that is trapped by the more pragmatic decision-making part of your personality and in all of our personalities. And that is all the context for this series. And for me, why it is so satisfying to watch, because it lends itself to so many different aspects of the things we deal with every day, in the cults that form around these corporations, in the way that we suppress aspects of ourselves to be successful at work, in how making those decisions have in many ways, let's look at Irving here. Maybe he would have been an artist in another version of his life. And there's a lot going on with Irving, by the way. Maybe one of the most fascinating aspects of the show was rewatching it through his character. And I'll kind of do that as we walk through the rest of this, looking at the story through each one of these characters' perspectives. And of course, by actually bifurcating your personality from the inside and the outside, how you are able to unintentionally keep secrets from each other, or perhaps intentionally, right? That might be the goal of this split. And how that perfectly lends itself to a conspiracy thriller, because think of all the secrets that the corporation could be keeping from their employees because of this technology itself. And of course, that dovetails perfectly with yet another cultural moment here as well. That Severance, of course, is a workplace comedy to some extent. It is a high-level science fiction series that makes us ask questions about our memories and our own personalities, like films in this vein, like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, for example. But of course, it also is a conspiracy thriller, which is extremely popular now as we have become more and more mistrustful of our institutions and simultaneously have ceded a lot of our decision-making and our own individual power to these large mega corporations that have become so financially powerful and in the end really define the society we live in, for better and worse. It's really a melting pot of these different themes. And as I mentioned, more of the moment now than even 3 years ago. And one last thing to throw into the mix, not directly a plot point, not yet anyway, in the series, but AI has now even elevated this to another extent, not because there is AI in this series, but when you consider the idea that we have this fear that there are potentially these AI agents that will be doing our jobs in the future. And what are they doing behind our backs? And what are they actually up to? And can we trust what they're doing? And now these corporations may be doing nefarious things with that AI. The AI might be being nefarious behind the scenes. We don't even know what it might be thinking, quote unquote. And if we consider the fact that within this series itself, the corporation may have hundreds of thousands of these anonymous workers doing work they don't understand, we don't understand how it's all happening, and invisible to any kind of public scrutiny, I think that's just one more tension that dovetails perfectly with the themes in this series. Okay, before we start getting into each one of these characters, let's look into some of the aspects of this belief system around Lumen and specifically the Egan family. There's not enough time to get into all these things. I just realized how much ground there is to cover here. But briefly, let me bring up Lumen's 9 core principles. Vision, verve, wit, cheer, humility, benevolence, nimbleness, probity, and wiles. Throughout the course of the show, by the way, notice that by the end of season 1, to a large extent, the company is being undermined by their very employees, the innies, who are using what they've learned in these corporate handbooks and around these principles themselves. So let's put a pin in that just momentarily, that is a big theme. Even under the most rigid systems of control, some aspect of rebellion can still not be suppressed, even if it is couched in those very philosophies. So maybe over the course of season 2, we'll get into those particular aspects. But what I really want to talk about, because it's so central to so much that happens in season 1, is the 4 tempers. So those 4 tempers are woe, frolic, dread, and malice. And these are directly stolen in the context of the series, I think we're to presume this, from the ancient Greek and Roman concept of how people's temperaments are made up of 4 humors. And there is a lot of borrowing from Greek and Roman mythology throughout Kier's philosophy, so not surprising here either. Those 4 humors, the traditional ones, were black bile, which was melancholic or depressed, correlates, of course, to woe. Second humor was sanguine, which is blood, red, and sanguine correlated to energy or playfulness, which of course correlates to frolic. Then there was yellow bile, choleric, which correlated to aggression. And of course, that is malice. And lastly was phlegm, and phlegm correlated to fear and reticence, which of course is dread. Even the colors overlap to a large extent. We have the green, we have the yellow, we have the red. I don't think we have black in the Lumen color scheme, but even the colors mostly correlate. And of course, these 4 tempers are all over the series itself. There is a painting in which we see Keir taming the 4 tempers. And of course, the characters in that painting are represented with these papier-mâché heads in the dance sequence at the waffle party in the final episodes of season 1. The ram is aggression, the jester is frolic, the younger female character is woe, with a veil on. I'm not sure what that represents, to be honest. And dread is this character, which honestly is very reminiscent of Harmony Cobell with the silver hair. So maybe more to come in that regard. And I wanted to start here because it's been theorized that the 4 characters that we see in the series represent each one of those. So Mark, for example, is woeful for the loss of his wife. And Helly is malicious because she's always aggressive. And Irv, of course, always concerned that they're violating some rule and always encourages the team to be forthright when they've violated some policy. And perhaps Dylan being frolic, considering that he's the one who's having the most fun, appears to be having the most fun in the series. And I would argue that that is a very simple read on what's happening here. It definitely is the way they present initially, but it's very important that over the course of the season that each one of these characters transforms from one of these aspects to another. But intentionally or not, the series does seem to play with the idea that there is some balancing of these different aspects or humors, if you want to call them that, within these characters. Mark obviously is motivated initially by woe, by the loss of his wife. But that is his outie. But we see as soon as we see him within the context of his innie, as he's now inherited this position of power as the leader of the team, we see him be playful. We see that he has an emotional attachment to Helly and to the others on his team as well, but primarily to Helly, given that it's romantic. But then, of course, dread, which seems to be a central motivator for control within the organization itself, the fear of the break room as a mechanism of control. And then that constant dread, that fear that something bad can happen to one of his team members, especially after one of them tries to commit suicide, or the fear of additional reprisals, eventually motivates him to malice, to aggression against the organization. The first character, the very first character that we're introduced to in this very first scene of the series is actually Helly R. And of course, the first bit of dialogue we hear is Mark asking, "Who are you?" And near the very end of the season, when Helly, this same innie, is inhabiting her outie's body, the same question is asked, "Who are you?" And she's presented with the answer. So that is the symmetry of the season itself, but her trajectory is an interesting one as well. She immediately is malicious, but her motivating aspect, her balancing temper, let's say, is actually frolic. It is her flirtation with Mark, as well as the playfulness she indicates during her dance party, even in appreciating things like the egg party, for example. She does dread going to the break room again, but it doesn't seem to be the primary way that she can be controlled. Nonetheless, her attachment to Mark and to the team in general still leads her to the same direction, the malicious attack against the company in the final moments of season 1. And once again, an interesting trajectory when you consider these 4 tempers for Irv, who initially is very law and order, law-abiding, and primarily motivated by dread, and experiences dread throughout the course of the series, even early on, where he sees that black ooze dripping down onto his desk. Of course, we discover that it has more going to it, and we will get into that, by the way, how his outie may be trying to manipulate his internal experience. But then his temper is changed by frolic and energy, primarily in his romance with Bert. And of course, when he loses Bert, once again, seen as a punishment by the organization, his woe turns to malice, and then he is also aligned. The team all begins to align in the same direction, malice towards their captors. And lastly, we get to Dylan, and as I've already mentioned, he starts off, he seems to be the most playful, he seems to enjoy the work, he asks the fewest questions, but then motivated by dread, and of course, the loss of his son, a son he didn't know he had, all 4 team members by the end are all aligned in malice. The other really fascinating aspect of all of this is how they use the teachings of Kier as excuses to continue to break the rules. This is what Kier wanted. He wanted us to build a team. He wanted us to rely on each other. And then when that curdles, when the reins are too tight, how they all use their own beliefs and their own team that they've built according to the rules and weaponize it against the organization. And I think this is actually a very important theme of this entire show. The idea that the more tightly you attempt to control something, the more you lose control of it. And by the way, even the rebellion itself may all be part of a broader experiment being run by Lumen. And also, Lumen is fully aware of these aspects of these characters. To a large extent, I think what we're seeing here is a broad social experiment, but there is also a science fiction element to this as well. But within the context of that social experiment, all of these employees are being observed, not only the MDR team members, but the other team members across the organization and the managers that manage them. And of course, pulling these levers to control their employees. And if you want to see the seeds of a conspiracy here, we finally do meet face-to-face the current Egan CEO, and he mentions how he wants to have one of those chips in everybody's head. And of course, the more mainstream this idea becomes, potentially the more access Lumen would have to manipulate the people who have these chips. All right, a few more interesting things about the Lumen mythology. We discover that Kier started off selling these skin salves, literally snake oil salesman, and over time got into pharmaceuticals and now into broader technology. This is a little bit of a satire on so many of these companies, these giant companies over time that became these conglomerates that had their fingers into so many different types of technology and industries, but had these very sketchy origin stories. Just one you could bring up is how Coca-Cola used to be considered medicine and had actual coca leaves in it. So, of course, made you feel pretty good when you were drinking cocaine, liquid cocaine, and became, of course, a soft drink. No longer the supposed medicine that it was back in the day. Another interesting note is how we discover over the course of the series that the company was founded in 1866. Now, this was the year that of the ratification of the first civil rights laws of the country, of course, in the wake of the Civil War. And I don't think this is a coincidence, because something you continuously think about in watching Severance is how those people who are just expected to work all the time and have no personhood outside of the context of work is an obvious metaphor for slavery. And how can you circumvent the civil rights laws that exist and allow enslavement of people? What if people allow themselves to be enslaved? If you negate the personhood of the innie and give them no civil rights, it is a way to circumvent those very civil rights laws which were enacted in 1866. So I don't think that's a coincidence. All the way back when we were first covering this season of show, which is incredibly about 3 years ago. And actually, let me just have a minor digression here on some discovery I did about the actual production of this show. I can't believe it's been 3 years. And it turns out, we just saw the second season of Squid Game, which is a follow-up to the most successful season of any TV show ever in history, practically, from an international basis. And honestly, I don't know why that season of show took so long, considering that I don't believe it was impacted by any of the strikes from 2023, since it's not a U.S. production. But that certainly was the case for Severance, which is such an important series for the whole Apple TV project. They've had relatively few hits, and this is one of the few real conversation starters, which you can tell they are using it to launch a very aggressive year of a lot of sci-fi shows. Some of them seem really intriguing, although I am skeptical considering their current batting average for my interest level in the huge slate of science fiction shows they already have. That all remains to be seen, but they are really trying everything this year, and I think using this January launch of Severance as a springboard to probably promote a lot of those other shows. But given how important this was to Apple, you would think, why did they wait so long for this production? Well, Ben Stiller is just starting to do the rounds for season 2. By the way, the reviews for season 2, some of these critics have seen the entire 10. I envy them. They've seen all 10 episodes of the show, especially considering how much I really, truly loved binging this season of television now in this rewatch. that they got to binge it all, which is perhaps the proper way to watch this second season of TV. I have not watched it, as I mentioned. I've seen only the first 8 minutes, which are publicly available now on the Apple TV app, but encouraged that those early reviews have been nearly unanimously praising the show. And they mentioned that a lot of the mysteries of the show will be revealed in this very season of television, which is encouraging to hear. There's been quite a few, I'm not going to point them out now, but quite a few series that I was pretty enthusiastic about after season 1 that have really just spun their wheels in season 2. So to know that they have more story to tell and that will answer some of the big pressing questions in this current season, all that is very encouraging. So on this press tour, Stiller has been talking about the production of the show. And I started going down this rabbit hole because I was wondering to myself, where have these actors been, some of them, who really were unknown to me anyway, and relatively little seen, who really had huge breakouts in this first season of the show. Tremel Tillman as Seth Milchik, and even more so probably Britt Lauer playing Helly. So why didn't their careers take off? And I looked at their IMDb pages, and Britt Lauer does have a movie that's about to come out that played at some film festivals and got some very good reviews, especially for her performance, not surprisingly, considering how good she is here on the show. And Tremel Tillman is going to be in the latest Mission Impossible film coming out this summer. But what have they been doing in between these 2 seasons of TV? Where have they been? Well, the amazing thing about it is Ben Stiller was talking about how the show went into production late in 2022. 2022 was the year of the premiere of season 1, which of course was an immediate hit. They got a green light for season 2, and they weren't sitting on their hands for the next 2 years, for example. They actually went into production late the same year. Now, the first season had taken some 9 months to produce, and I believe they were scheduling. That's a very long timeline, by the way, for 9 episodes of TV. Season 2 is a bit longer, but a 9-month production schedule is pretty long period of time for a show this size. So they begin production. They go into the middle of 2023. They announce that they're about a month away from wrapping up production on the series. And then the writer's strike happens. And they shut down production on the series. But in my mind, I would have expected that they would have started doing post-production. Other parts of the production that were not on strike could have been doing their work. And theoretically, once production kicked off again, we could see a pretty quick turnaround on the season. There were some rumors that there was different visions for the show, and this kind of concerned me. And perhaps they did start to assemble the series and decided that some things were unclear, or they had a more ambitious version of the series, or maybe Apple wanted them to do something a little more ambitious. I don't know all of those details, but what ends up happening is production kicks off again, and theoretically, maybe a month or 2 to get back up to speed and finish production on the series. Actually, it takes another 7 or 8 months, almost as long as the full production up until that point again. And that brings us to the middle of 2024. And now about 6 months after that, we have the finished series. It looks like they have successfully extended the mythology of the series based on the early reviews. But all of those production delays and honestly probably reshooting big chunks of the original footage of the series eventually got the production all the way up to $200 million for 10 episodes. So it's incredible when you consider where they are shooting on relatively few sets. Although if you've seen the trailer, they definitely have some outside world sequences that are previewed right there. But I would presume that the vast majority of the series still takes place inside of those offices. All this is to say, where have those actors been? Why have their careers not taken off based on all the buzz they received from season 1? Well, they've been shooting season 2 for 2.5 years when you include the production delays due to the strikes. Okay, so that's where they've been. Let's talk about the characters themselves. All the way back in season 1, when we were covering here on the podcast, I was very curious about the names of the characters. Character names are always important, especially when you're watching movies. Also, the first time you see a character on screen, just kind of a rule of thumb, the first thing they say, the first time you see them, tells you a lot about who that character is. That is definitely the case here in this series. But the names, just to show the level of detail that gets put into these scripts, and even the set design, everything is so impeccable. Even the names have layers of metaphor within them. And this is analysis I began all the way back in those early episodes, but simply ran out of time to do a lot of this breakdown, especially later in this season when the plot really kicked into gear. We rarely went back to analyzing those names. So I want to do that right now as part of an introduction to not only the characters, but then also breaking down beats in the story and actual details of the plot. So from this point on, if you have not finished your rewatch, I'm going to talk about everything that the character does in the context of their name, but also their plot, how it ties into some of these other themes we've already introduced earlier. So if you haven't finished your rewatch or you've never watched the show, you may want to skip the rest of this conversation. And beyond that, we're going to get into speculation for season 2 based on this rewatch. So even more of a spoilers. So from this point on, you probably want to finish your rewatch before listening to any more of this analysis. So if anyone wants explicit warnings for spoilers, I am explicitly saying this is your spoiler warning. Our main point of view character, although this is probably going to change over the course of season 2, is Mark Scout, played by Adam Scott. And appropriately enough, Mark Scout. What is a mark? A mark is a target, right? If you're going to scam somebody, there you are, your mark. But a mark is also something you place on the map. A mark, a location, a destination, or a starting point. And of course, over the course of the series, we see that Mark draws a map. Mark receives a map from Petey. Rickon, his brother-in-law, at one point signs his book saying that Mark is the cartographer of the mind. And the map that Petey leaves for him explicitly has mind written across the top. So what kind of mark is Mark? Maybe both. Maybe a signifier, X marks the spot, but also a mark. He was targeted by Lumen, possibly because of his emotional state after his wife died. His wife, who apparently had been a Lumen employee. So was he marked intentionally? And his last name, Scout. What does a scout do? He surveys. He's the first one to go out to see the lay of the land, to make a map so that the team can plan. And in both his innie and outie state, he is pathfinding in both roles. He is the scout. All right, let's talk about Irving. Irving actually means green water. And if you want to think about the color green and water, going back to the idea of the 4 humors, phlegm is green if you're sick, and a phlegmatic temperament back in that context of the Greek and Roman philosophy of those 4 humors correlates to dread within the 4 tempers in the Kier philosophy. And that is indicative of what we see initially, that dread that motivates him. But we discover only when we are with his outie at the very end of the series that his last name is Bailiff. And what is a bailiff? The bailiff maintains order in the court. They are the enforcer of rules and boundaries. And of course, this also correlates to how we see him inside of Lumen, his innie, very much reminding everybody to play by the rules, stay in their place. But of course, that changes over time. But much more importantly is the fact that maybe this is an ironic name unless we discover something more about his outie's mission. Because when we finally spend time, once again, full spoilers here, with Irving, his outie, we discover that he's been doing his own analysis somehow, has gotten his hands on Lumen's current and former employees, and has notes on these papers. So despite the fact that supposedly nothing ever leaks out from inside of Lumen, from the severed floor, this is a very detailed accounting of the names and locations of those employees. So if indeed he is the bailiff, then why is he making maps of his own leading to the homes of these different severed employees? Very interesting detail here. I don't have a theory for this, by the way, but very interesting detail that when he discovers this list of addresses for the employees, he has already marked Bert Goodman's position on the map. So I guess we will find that out relatively early in season 2. Was there some kind of outside communication between Bert and Irving? I want to spend a few more moments on Irving because this is the most fascinating aspect. It may unlock layers and layers of what's going on in this show. So I might just use this as a starting point to that conversation. First of all, let's just wrap up the name thing. Bert Goodman, I think that one's pretty straightforward. The Goodman part is simply that he's a good man, and that is what brings the two of them together. Also, just the fact Bert and Irving almost sounds like Bert and Ernie. And of course, there was Bert and Ernie, the Sesame Street characters who were always together, felt like a couple to a lot of people. There's always that joke that they are a couple. And as a matter of fact, they sleep in the same bed. So maybe that just says everything you need to know. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little bit of a wink there in the naming of the characters. But much more importantly is what is going on with Irv's Audi. He obviously has information about the inner workings of Lumen, certainly information he's not supposed to have. Number two, he keeps painting over and over and over again the exact same image. This long hallway with this red light in the distance. We see this only one time in the season. I believe only one time. We see it when Miss Casey is being retired. Presumably, Miss Casey has no Audi. If this is where the innies go that have no Audis, which seems to be designated on the map, by the way, with question marks. If this is where they go into storage, how has Irving seen this? Was he at some point a permanent innie? Was he at some point an unsevered employee of the organization? Not only does he seem to have some memory of something that he really shouldn't, that very few of the severed would actually have, presumably, unless they've all been reset many, many times, and maybe that's a possibility as well. But I think he is trying to communicate with his innie. He is trying to create an image over and over again, perhaps to train himself to almost subconsciously draw this thing as some kind of message to his inner self. He's listening to the Ace of Spades over and over. Every time we see him painting, he's listening to the same song on repeat. So this is some kind of training that he's trying to ingrain in his subconscious, something that he hopes will transcend the barrier between these two selves. And there is some other indoctrination here as well. When Irv wakes up, once again, full spoilers, once Irv wakes up inside of his Audi, in the body, the Audi body, with the innie conscience, he immediately starts to investigate the apartment and gravitates to this footlocker, where he finds the Navy uniform, maybe his own, but definitely his father's as well, and almost intuitively knows to look underneath it. The keys, of course, are in his pocket. And this is where he finds that trove of employee names and addresses, which leads him to Bert at the conclusion of the season. So this is maybe the character or the thread that's hanging from these happenings that I find most intriguing, and I can't wait to follow up on. I actually have some speculation. I will leave that for speculation at the very end of this podcast episode. That was a pretty long digression. I probably should have gotten some of these easier names out of the way sooner. Let me get a couple of the smaller ones out of the way. Dylan George. Dylan, the origin of the name Dylan is Welsh and means great flow, or roughly son of the sea or born of the sea. And there's a lot of water references in these names, by the way. So a lot of water references, a lot of nautical references. George traditionally means a farmer, so not sure how that ties in. Maybe something in his backstory. We have seen very little of his Audi's life other than the fact that he has one son, apparently more than one son, although only one that we saw him with. Where was his wife when he was on the outside? Is he going through a divorce? There are theories that he was a workaholic, and that's why he separated himself so that he could be a workaholic at work, but then be disconnected from that fixation at home. All remains to be seen. We have not seen a lot of his Audi's persona, unlike, of course, Mark, where we spent much time with him on the outside, and Irving, where we've had these tantalizing clues as to who this person is and how he's spending his time. Oh, one more thing on Irving I forgot to mention. Another thing we see when we spend time with him, he has a full pot of coffee filled to the very brim. It's like more than a day's worth of coffee, and he has made that pot of coffee for late in the day. So is he forcing himself to stay up and paint all night so that Irving, his innie, Irv, falls asleep and some of this subconscious messaging starts to leak through? Apparently, we've seen it happen, right? Primarily with the ooze that he sees, the paint that is dripping onto his desk. Another secondary character we need to talk about, of course, is Miss Casey. Casey comes from the word case, which means to be vigilant or watchful. You think of the terminology like casing out the joint. And of course, she is in her role as the wellness director. She is always watching and the employees for any signs of mental distress. And her Audi, of course, Gemma, which comes from gem, a precious jewelry. And if you think about having to excavate some kind of precious stone, Gemma, of course, is inside of Lumen and is the precious thing for Mark's Audi, of course, the thing he's excavating during his investigation. And one more minor character, such an endurable character, by the way, Rickon Hale. You think about those two names. Rickon means rich. Hale, spelled differently, of course. You think of someone who's like hale and hearty, healthy and full of vitality. And of course, the irony of the name that he presents that he is the all-knowing Rickon, Hale. It feels like a made-up name. And of course, how it masks all his insecurities that we see in the course of the show. I'm going to talk about his philosophy and how it actually ironically dovetails with a very contradictory philosophy, the Kier philosophy, the Lumen philosophy. But it is an interesting mirror image of that. And maybe pertains to some revelations that will come at some point in the future. Okay, I very much intentionally left some of the most intriguing name revelations here towards the end. Let's start with Helly. Of course, we have the whole revelation that Helena is actually an Egan. And in Greek mythology, Helena is the torchbearer. And this is why I had made the supposition all the way back when the series was on TV, the first season, that she may actually have been an Egan. And my speculation turned out to be correct. But there's more going on there with that name. Helena, mythologically also Helen of Troy, who of course triggers a massive war, but also importantly, the Trojan horse. She is a Trojan horse in both directions. They send her in as a Trojan horse way to try to make a mainstream pitch that, hey, one of our own is willing to do this. How bad can it be? And look at how wonderful her experience is as an innie. But of course, she becomes a Trojan horse in another way at the very event, the moment where they need to make the pitch that Severance is a mainstream idea to win over political and popular support. Helena becomes the Trojan horse of that undoing, potentially, when Helly emerges. And there's an incredible scene in the finale when Helly speaks to her father. And I'll get into that in a little more detail when we get into speculation for season 2. One more thing about Helly, of course, the inner version of herself is Helly, right? Not Helena, she's Helly, and she's in hell. Pretty straightforward, that interpretation. One more thing about the names. Her name is Egan, the way it's spelled. She's Helly R. You put the R with the Egan, you get Reagan, and you think about, arguably, this current world of corporatism above nationalism even really begins in the 80s. And of course, how that philosophy really did dovetail with Reaganomics at the time. Companies given complete free rein will make better choices than governments and institutions that would govern them. And lastly, Egan sounds like eager. And you think about Helly, or Helena, I should say, her outie, making this video and making the choice to be an innie, perhaps to win over her dad's adulation. And of course, you think about the cruelty she shows to her innie, literally telling her, you are not a person. I am a person. You are not a person. And you think about that cruelty, and is that truly how she feels? Or is that what she's saying to reprimand that innie because this experiment of her being an innie is so important to messaging this technology when all we see of the outside world is a growing mistrust in the media and, of course, among the younger generation of workers who do not want to be brainwashed into being well-behaved innies for their corporate overlords. Oh, and I was about to jump to Miss Cobell, but I can't forget Seth Milchik. We don't discover that his name is Seth until later in the season, but Milchik is a very interesting name because it means milk, but in pharmacology is also a substance used as a purgative, but also can be used as a mild antiseptic. And then the first name, Seth, potentially contradictory interpretations here. The Yiddish Seth is pronounced sate, as in satiating or satisfying. But the Egyptian god Seth was kind of like Loki, a bit of a trickster. So maybe hinting at the different persona we see. By the end of season 1, Seth has betrayed Cobell, or maybe not. Maybe he is thinking that he is just doing the right thing because Cobell obviously has her own agenda, and we'll break down some of her character details in just a moment. But most obviously, the satiation, he is the distributor of the rewards, right? He keeps the employees satisfied. And of course, Milchik, a large glass of milk, can be nutritious and satisfying. But of course, the pharmacological interpretation that it can also be a mild antiseptic as well. Okay, let's talk about Patricia Arquette's character, Harmony Cobell, Mrs. Selvig. Interesting that she has these two names, of course. Unlike most of the other characters who reuse their name, the ones who are actually severed, and yet she has two explicitly different names. but she is not severed. It actually makes you raise the question. It raises the question as to whether she wants to be severed. And she is the most mysterious character here. Her motivations may be contradictory. And honestly, all the biggest mysteries of the series itself come together in this one character. First of all, her name is Harmony. Her first name is Harmony. So the idea of balancing out these four tempers, theoretically, they would be harmonious. Is she an harmonized version of these tempers? I would say that that is not what we see here. But there are questions as to what aspects of her personality that we see are a performance. So one really big question mark, what are Harmony's actual intentions? We see, for example, that she truly does care for Mark. She watches Mark from her window and cries for him. When she sees Mark at the party in the season finale and hears from the Audi that he's thinking of leaving the company, she hugs him and says, "Get away from them," and seems to honestly believe it. She sees Mark and Helly getting closer and wandering around unsupervised and doesn't report it, and actually covers it up when Granger notices it as well. And yet she is the first one to discipline and torture them. But is that only to maintain her status in the company? Because she's torn in having to make her metrics and then caring for these people potentially for real. We also know that she, from that shrine she has in her basement, that she had attended the Egan Girls' School. And she even seems to have her basement mocked up with some of her artwork on the wall. In a way, she has tried to preserve the experience of being one of these children. Is she perhaps running her own experiments based on how she was experimented on as a child now on these employees? Also intriguingly, she repeatedly is putting Mark's innie in close proximity to Miss Casey over and over again, sending him to wellness. And Milchik knows, in his reaction being like, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Something you don't really pick up on until you rewatch, because we don't discover the whole Gemma connection until very late in the series. When you see Milchik questioning her every single time that he sends her for wellness with Miss Casey, or has Miss Casey hang out for the entire day watching Helly, but being in close proximity to Mark, Milchik seems very skeptical about this every time. And of course, you see in that final wellness visit that she leans into the screen so curious she believes for a moment that maybe he is recognizing her. And it's not that she's afraid of this. She wants it to happen. And she's actually disappointed that it does not. So what does that say? That she is trying to see if love will somehow cross the severance barrier. She, of course, is also very vested in her theory that Petey has reintegrated his personalities. I have a possible theory, but I will leave it for the speculation section here towards the end of this episode. Let's keep talking about the name, though. Regardless of, given what I just described there, harmonious does not seem to be the way I would describe her personas. As a matter of fact, it seems very ironic when you compare her Selvig persona to her Cobell persona. Oh, another mystery before I forget to bring it up. When she finally destroys her shrine after she's been fired from the company, she obviously is not someone who's trying to destroy the company. She is a true believer based on the fact that she literally worships at the shrine of the Egans. What is the mystery of her upbringing? We still don't know. Something to do with her mother, which she categorizes at one moment as an atheist who said that hell does not exist. But the good news about hell, this is the very first episode, is that hell does not exist. The bad news is that people will create it. And of course, perhaps that is one interpretation of this severed floor. And later says that her mother was a Catholic and very faithful person. So what does it say about these two aspects of her mother? Was her mother severed? Was she one of the early severed people? So did she experience two versions of her mother? Was she traumatized by perhaps being loved by one of these mother selves and not the other? That explains some of this, but I'm still not certain if it explains everything, because presumably she would be very vested in reintegrating some personality currently, when of course her mother has died. As a matter of fact, we see one of the artifacts she has down there when she's destroying the shrine is a respiratory tube with a date on it from a hospital wristband. And the date of birth is 44, so presumably her mother who passed away, and confirmed by one of the showrunners in one of their interviews saying that that tube held her mother's last breath. So that's not in the show, by the way. That comes from an interview outside of the scope of the show. But taking that all into account, she obviously has this fixation with her mother. She has a fixation with her upbringing, being raised at one of these Egan schools. What kind of guinea pig was she in the context of that educational system? Was her mother severed? Did the technology exist back then? Questionable, of course. If Helly saw it as a girl, and this is a 30-something-year-old woman, when her dad says to her, Helly's dad, that is, says to her, I remember when you first saw the prototype. So theoretically, that would have been too late for Cobell's mother to have the procedure and have lost this connection to her. But maybe there was some rudimentary version of this in her childhood. Anyway, all these are mysteries, unsolved at this point, and extremely compelling. A few other things about her name. Cobell sounds like cobble, which is to cobble together something out of different materials, for example. Maybe something that she's doing with these two persona. But perhaps more tellingly, Cobell also is slightly modified in spelling, is also the name of a traditional fishing boat, or the people who man those boats. So is she fishing? Is she a fisherman? What is she fishing for? Some candidate, maybe, by running her own experiments on her employees. And perhaps she's not the bad guy that we presume. Perhaps she is trying to discover a way to save these innies if indeed they can somehow be reunified with their outies. Because as cruel a mom as she may be, these innies do not exist if everybody quits the company. The only way to save these people, who perhaps she loves and wants to save, is to reintegrate them into their outies. And of course, she needs to keep her job. And the only way to keep her job is to have a performant team. I'm very curious again to see what happens in season 2 now that she has lost that job. And you might say, oh, well, maybe they're rewinding all that because she caught onto it or whatever. If you've seen the first 8 minutes of season 2, if you've seen the trailer for season 2, you know that she indeed, at least temporarily, is truly fired from the company. Oh, and of course, we can't move on without mentioning Selvig. We only know her last name. We never discover her first name unless I missed it somewhere. I do not believe there's any first name allocated to her. But Selvig is a very important symbolic name since Selvig actually means self. It means the house of the self. It's right in the word, Selvig, with the V, swap it for an F. So you think about the house of the self, harmony. Is she trying to harmonize the innies and the outies? Is that her overall goal? Okay, I'm going to try to coalesce all this, all these different points I've been trying to make here into something more coherent in my speculation for season 2 or into the broader mysteries of the series. But before we get there, I wanted to point out something that I find really interesting and only something I picked up on the second watch. Rickon is such a hilarious character and obviously is a satire on the whole self-help new age culture, which continues now, obviously, especially with like online influencers and things. But in the form of these self-help books really was something that took off decades ago, probably starting in like the 80s and 90s, where they were probably at their peak. But a lot of these, how to fix yourself, how to train yourself, and not coincidentally, a lot of those books were also around corporate speak. All these CEOs wrote their own books, and all these people trained CEOs on like, here's how to be a better CEO. Here's how to be a better leader. Here's how to become more efficient. Here's how to motivate people without money. So it's interesting that these two things came up in parallel, oftentimes written by the same people, by the way, either overtly or behind the scenes. And what's interesting is to see in the series how these innies who have no kind of cultural feedback read the corporate handbook as if it is a Bible. And it's written in that way, but a way to become a rule book for all of life's decisions. And perhaps not coincidentally, this is also what we see in Rickon's book. The excerpts we see from it, oftentimes when the innies are reading the book as well. And of course, it resonates with them, A, because they have no other culture inside of there. They don't have movies. They don't have other books. They are blank slates. So they are prepped for this type of philosophy. And it is interesting that you see how this new philosophy infiltrating the old philosophy becomes the straw that broke the camel's back, that all of these innies who work in different departments, who are fed propaganda. By the way, we see two different versions of this supposed coup that occurred where MDR supposedly murdered or massacred the O&D team, but then we see the opposite as well. So we see that this is just propaganda. It's just a way to keep them from working together. By keeping them divided and working against each other, they are easier to control. And of course, this is how politics works as well. It's the reason that we have so many issues that are so divisive that are always considered like the voting issue of any election cycle. It's whatever will split the group exactly 50-50. In this regard, it's simply just mistrust of the other group. And whatever lies you tell one team, you tell the other team about the previous team, and that way they just simply do not trust each other. So we see these different ways that these groups are being controlled, but they need to be controlled rigidly with this very, very finite set of rules. So all of a sudden, having an exterior voice, any kind of culture at all, will disrupt this ecosystem that's been carefully cultivated. The irony of this is that it leads to rebellion internally. However, on the outside world, there's definitely commentary here that this philosophy is just as hollow in many ways as the Cure philosophy, because Ricken's followers have this same kind of childlike wonder, this mistrust of basic information, this new age-like philosophy to always listen to your interior voice. So my point is that the innies, because of this rigid parenting and this forced banishment of any external culture, are childlike and simply receive the information from their employer as the totality of the world. Ricken's followers, on the other hand, follow his philosophy, which also makes them seem, apparently, you look at these people in all their interactions, and they are also very childish and seem to have no historical perspective either, but they are choosing to ignore the outside world and also end up following these simplified set of rules. So the result is the same, even though the philosophy is so diametrically opposed. As a matter of fact, overtly in this book, there are all these sections that the employees gravitate to, the innies, that overtly state that the individual, your feelings about something, your individual intuitions are your primary guiding principle, as opposed to doing it all for the sake of the organization. So I don't think the show agrees with either of these philosophies, but perhaps shows you that there are people out there, whether they want to be supplicants to some power structure or be supplicants to some guru and some new age philosophy, there is some kind of internal desire to surrender the self to somebody else. So is it possible that Ricken is also somehow been programmed by Lumen in some unknown past history? And this is all part of this broader Cure experiment, which maybe isn't just happening inside of Lumen, is happening in the surrounding area as well. I would say I'll have some more to say about that when we get to speculation, but just on the Ricken side of things, I am nearly 100% certain that Ricken, if that's the case, Ricken is not aware of this. He's too naive. When Mark compliments his writing, he takes it all way too earnestly, so he's not conniving in any way, but he may inadvertently have been programmed in some way by some Cure experiment. And there's a big question as to whether there are more severed people in this show than we are aware of. And not to go into potentially more of a Cure conspiracy behind his activities, but just to talk about the themes of the series itself, I'm pretty sure that what the creators of the show want us to take away from this satirization of the corporate idolization, as well as this new age self-help industry, is that just in general, looking for easy answers, looking for a simple solution for the complexities of life and not accepting the complexity of lives, in general, make you prey to some ideology. And in general, that is a bad thing. And that is why we see it villainously evil on one side and buffoonish and farcical on the other. All right, here's when we get into speculation. So once again, if you don't like speculation, tune out now. This is already a very long episode of this podcast specifically, but we are approaching the end. Okay, some speculation on what we might expect to see in season 2. And I'm going to say this obvious thing here, which I should have said at the top of the episode, but these 4 tempers, woe, frolic, malice, and dread, what work are these folks actually doing? I have an unpublished conversation, maybe I'll publish it at some point in the future, where I was discussing this show with my sister on her rewatch. She had rewatched it before I had. And her theory was that they're not doing anything. There aren't actually scary numbers or whatever, that it's all in their heads and they are just part of an experiment and Lumen is just watching them. I think that is the most psychological version of this without any of the science fiction elements. But I actually disagree in part. I absolutely believe that they are inside of an experiment. But when they say that a set of numbers was scary to them, that correlates to dread. When they say that some of the numbers make you feel happy sometimes, that is frolic. If they make you feel sad, that is woe. And of course, they also mention at one point described as, well, some of them will make you feel angry. And of course, that is malice. So the numbers that they're seeing and the human behavior or the human intuition is something that machines can't do. This human intuition of identifying those patterns in the numbers. And to correlate to that, if you've noticed, watch carefully next time you watch this show, when they put those numbers into the box, a little pop-up comes out that shows the levels of each one of those. And once they've correctly identified each one of those sets, which of course are designated as WO for woe, FL I think it is for frolic, MA for malice, and DR or DE, something like that for dread. But those are explicitly on the screen, pretty easy to correlate them to these four, and you see these progress bars. So they are identifying these aspects in this metadata, this massive data, and they're putting it into these boxes. And once they've completed that task, the job is complete. My theory, here's my theorizing now. My theory is that they are identifying actual memories or patterns of thinking correlated to those four tempers as a way to potentially balance or harmonize someone's personality. And maybe the chip that does the severing doesn't just sever one set of memories from another, but perhaps dampens the different aspects of your personality until you become this balanced, harmonized person. So is that what this technology does? That by putting these chips into everybody, it's not just to sever them, but to make them these perfect employees, balancing out these tempers, these imbalanced aspects, which theoretically make us who we are. And maybe that is why we see these characters who are flattened out and childlike inside of Lumen when they're innies versus Mark on the outside. Mark is a very different person when he's hanging out with his sister and they have this history and he can be sarcastic. And there's a much more naive version, a performative version of that character inside of Lumen. So is that his personality with these own edits that he's been making to his files? But are they also potentially modifying other people's files? So that's my theory, that somehow this macro data cleaning that they're doing is actually making modifications. I mean, if they were doing it to their own personas or to other team members, that would be really fascinating, especially because there's 4 buckets that they put these files into, and there's 4 team members. So is it a way where they are a feedback loop of self-correcting their own personalities? They could also be childlike in the way they are because they don't have exterior experiences, adult experiences. So that could possibly be the case as well. But I'm pretty sure that there's something in the macro data editing that has to do with the chips and manipulating folks through modifications to those chips. Now, how does this all tie together with the goats? That's a good question. How does this all tie together with the goats? But one more possible speculation here. Once again, going back to Helly's conversation with her father, he mentions how proud he is of her and how if she does a good job that night, they'll be putting chips into everybody, which is what she had said. It's so beautiful. I hope everybody gets to have one when she was a girl. And he goes, and they will because of what you did. Of course, Helly sabotages all of that. But another important point is that he mentions that he can't wait to have her at his side on the day of his revolution, I think he calls it. And that made me think about the chips once again. What if the chips are not only separating one persona from another and potentially creating a harmonized version of that person, and maybe that is the pitch, but what if it allows transplantation as well? We already know that Petey's chip was copied, so Granger didn't need the original. But is it possible that Petey could be transplanted into somebody else? Once again, we have not seen evidence of that. It is just that one line of dialogue. But it does make me wonder if it's possible that some of these outies are transplanted previous experiments. And even if that was the case, what is the long-term strategy for the organization? I do not know. But I am deeply intrigued. Now, by the way, I know people who got get turned off by this show because of all the things I just said. Sona, probably my co-host, probably one of the people who would be turned off by this level of speculation. And I do like when a puzzle box type show introduces a deep mythology and then pays it off in some satisfying way. It rarely happens. It didn't happen with Lost. It didn't happen with The X-Files. But The X-Files is a good example of a show that you followed because you just loved the shenanigans that these characters got into and the characters themselves. And that's my last point here, is that I love the show for the characters. I love the show for the world it lives in and the satire of things that are recognizable in our own fixation with these ever more powerful corporate behemoths and the celebrity CEOs that run them, and all the things it makes me think about in the way that we relate to those organizations, the way that we allow ourselves to be manipulated by them, the way that we compromise aspects of ourselves through the very jobs that we have oftentimes. And that's the reason I stick around with the show. But I also enjoy speculating on these deeper mysteries. One more piece of speculation here regarding Irv. I don't know how it ties into the broader conspiracy, but I did tease it when I was discussing Irv's Audi perspective and what's going on with the potential brainwashing he's attempting to do to his innie. On Rewatch, I noticed a couple of things. There is a watermelon party or melon party when Bert retires. And Bert, the Audi, gets to pick the song that gets played. And I don't know how this ties into the overall storyline, but I guarantee you that there will be a scene. By the way, it's been teased in the trailer. We see a watermelon of Bert's face. Bert's Audi will choose to retire or be forced to retire. And Bert's innie will be at the watermelon party and they will play his preferred song. And that song will be The Ace of Spades by Motorhead. And this will trigger something. Something is going to happen. Those memories and maybe some other encoded information is going to be triggered in innie Irv. And it's going to set something into motion. I don't know what that is. I'm just guaranteeing you that all those seeds have been planted. The song selection and Irv knows about this. By the way, Audi Irv not only has access to these employee records, knows that that is the exit process for employees. He knows a lot of stuff. He has a very interesting background. I don't know what it is, but we will know a lot more about that in this upcoming season of TV. Just another random piece of speculation, which is definitely going to happen, but pretty useless because I don't know exactly what it's going to lead to. But I thought I'd call it out. I have other random thoughts that I probably missed. And as I'm editing this, I will think of other ones as well. Things I missed, forgot to mention. But what are your favorite theories? Maybe something I didn't touch on, maybe something you've speculated on, maybe something you noticed the second time around if you have rewatched this show, or even the first time around. If you have a theory that I have not touched on here, or some revelation about the symbolic nature of some of the characters and their names, maybe a hidden history for them, or relationship between multiple characters on the outside world. If you happen to have anything that you want to share with the listeners, send me an email, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. I look forward to your theories. As I mentioned later this week, the 8th episode of The Agency. I am still very much vested in that series and things are coming to a head. So if you are behind on that one, definitely catch up. This should be an eventful week and next week should be extremely eventful on that series. Also next week, of course, Severance Season 2, the premiere. And as I mentioned, if you have not seen the first 8 minutes of the show and you're curious about it, available on Apple TV right now. Oh, I forgot to mention here in this analysis that there is also an external piece of information available on your Apple phone right now. If you have an iPhone, there is an additional clue to potentially what's happening at Lumen, and everybody has access to it for free. It's called the Lexington Letter. So search in your book app if you have an iPhone for Severance or the Lexington Letter, and it should pop up. And I do have a few things to say, possible clues in that extra piece of text. Maybe I'll save that, or I will save that, I should say, for maybe one more episode on Severance next week. And I'll discuss and break down that book and maybe some clues that are in there. It's only 43 pages long, along with maybe some feedback from some of my co-hosts on their rewatch of Severance as well. So stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. It did make me make some new connections, and I can't wait for season 2. Until then, enjoy your rewatch, enjoy The Agency. I'll talk to you soon.